It's Joshua Rosenberg with Law in Action.
The former Prime Minister of the UK, the Right Honourable Tony Blair, welcome to the University of Hong Kong. Thank you for coming.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay, you wanting to...
That was certainly not the first attempt to arrest Tony Blair, and not the last either. The activist you heard there has been telling us that he was following legal advice that he'd read on a website that offers rewards of around £2,000 to anyone who tries to arrest the former Prime Minister for what are alleged to be crimes against peace. Can you really do that? When can you make a citizen's arrest?
The Geneva Convention.
Okay, you made your point. Now, why don't you let me get on and make mine? Okay, thank you very much. Go on.
Thank you. I think you've made your point. Thank you very much. I'm sure you're used to this all the time.
I am used to it, but it's...
The activist who attempted to arrest Tony Blair in Hong Kong in 2012 was Tom Grundy, and someone else had a go at a restaurant in London earlier this year. Tom Grundy told Law in Action he'd heard about a website that offers a reward to people attempting a peaceful citizen's arrest of the former Prime Minister for launching military action against Iraq in 2003.
I was already quite aware of the case against Mr. Blair. I rose up from one of the rear rows and said my piece as I went towards him, putting to him some of the legal sections.
Excuse me, a lot of people have come...
The Geneva Convention.
Okay.
I was reading what statutes and charters and articles of the UN conventions and such he may be liable under, and ensured that, I knew what I was talking about if I was going to try something like this.
Well, you made your point. There it is. And that's democracy for you. So...
And then I deliberately made the choice that I was going to leave peacefully if it came to that, because I obviously didn't want to make a scene and focus the attention on myself. And in that sense, it was successful.
A crime against peace is not an offence under English law. But even if it was, can anyone make a citizen's arrest? Andrew Taylor is a barrister specialising in criminal law. In January, he successfully defended Andrew Woodhouse, a businessman from Abergavenny who was cleared of using unreasonable force against two men who stole fuel from his yard. What is a citizen's arrest?
The right for a citizen to actually arrest a person goes back for many hundreds of years, but I must say it's not for the faint-hearted. Very often people think they have the right to arrest a person who's in the process of committing an offence or perhaps has just committed the offence, and of course that's absolutely right. The example being if you lived in a rural or semi-rural area and you thought that a burglar was about to make his way from your property and you detained him with the property that he was attempting to steal until the police arrived. The difficulty with some people performing citizens' arrests is that they themselves might be liable to further litigation because, of course, you need to act properly, you need to act within the law, and it could give rise to all sorts of claims against you. You could be charged, for example, in the civil law with wrongful arrest, false imprisonment, or even kidnap. Apart from the fact that many people who think they're performing a lawful citizen's arrest might in fact arrest a person who could be extremely violent, extremely unpredictable, might be under the influence of drink, drugs or both, and therefore although you think you're acting on the side of the righteous, you might end up perhaps getting the wrong end of the stick and perhaps yourself being exposed to violence that you wouldn't have encountered had you not perhaps stood back, called the police and waited for the law to take its course in the normal event.
And can you arrest somebody for any offence they may be committing?
Most offences you can. They have to be offences either that are triable on indictment or triable either way. So, for example, most theft cases, most assault cases, yes, you can in fact perform an arrest. But if a person was seen to be parking on double yellow lines, driving a car perhaps without due care and attention, or perhaps if you suspected that they didn't have a valid MOT or a valid insurance certificate, that would not give you the right to arrest, because many of those offences in any event are not arrestable offences anyway.
And what about if you came across a thief a day after he'd burgled your house? You recognised him, but he was walking down the street. Could you arrest him then?
Well, if, for example, you thought that if you didn't arrest him, he is liable to escape and there are no police officers present, or, for example, the police have not been called and have not had any leads that might take them to that person, you might, in certain circumstances, lawfully arrest that person. The vast majority of people who perform citizens' arrests properly and within the law either see an offence being committed or, in fact, have just seen it committed and they act more or less on the spur of the moment. What you don't have, of course, is the same right as a police officer. Police officers very often arrest people on suspicion, and it's not suspicion that comes to those directly from what they've seen or what they've heard. It comes from the statements and information from other people. So, for example, they've gone along and they've collected evidence from other sources, they've welded that together, and therefore they form reasonable suspicion as the result of what other people take them. A citizen doesn't have that power, and if he tried to exercise power in that way, I'm afraid that he himself could find himself in very hot water.
And it helps if you're bigger than him as well, I suppose.
It does help if you're bigger, and of course you must be a person, I think, of reasonable fortitude and a person perhaps who is prepared to do more than most to defend themselves and their property.
Now, what about somebody like Tom Grundy, who comes across Tony Blair, thinks that Tony Blair is guilty of war crimes, goes up to him and says, "Mr. Blair, I'm arresting you." Can he do that?
I'm afraid he can't. Tom Grundy did not see Tony Blair committing an offence. The majority of times when a citizen's arrest is lawfully performed, the police are not there, and so you have the right to arrest only if it's really a matter of last resort. And of course, in Tom Grundy's case, he may think that Tony Blair has committed an offence, but the offence that he thought he committed would probably not give him the right for a citizen to intervene in those circumstances. If it had been the case that he wanted to report Mr. Blair, I'm afraid there are other more august bodies that would carry out the investigation and arrest if they thought it was appropriate.
And somebody like Tony Blair normally has police officers with him at all times anyway.
Well, he normally has police officers there as a former Prime Minister. And of course, the other dangerous territory when you arrest a person with Mr. Blair's perhaps fame and reputation is that you yourself could be on the receiving end of a writ and it could cost you an awful lot of money.
Andrew Taylor.